special day for us in India. It is Gandhi Jayanti. And as the father of our nation led the freedom struggle, he also had a very deep interest in international affairs. He was educated abroad. He lived for 24 years in South Africa. And when I opened the mission there in 1994, every aspect of our presence there was suffused with his presence. And everywhere I went, there was something connected with him, whether it was Tolstoy Farm or Phoenix Farm, or even the streets of Pretoria where he had walked. He had a very deep interest in foreign affairs, and as you go through his works, you will find that he had a view. He had a well-considered, well-conceived view. He was particularly, his thoughts were important in connection with the Palestine issue. And while he had sympathy for the predicament of the Jewish community, he had no sympathy for Zionism. And a major effort was mounted at that time to persuade him to speak about the Jews in a more sympathetic manner. And he did not do so. So you have him speaking about the Palestinians all those years ago. Coming forward rapidly, I'm going to speak to you about our western borders. There was a time not so long ago when we used to divide geographically these spaces with which we are concerned. South Asia, West Asia, North Africa, the Mediterranean, etc. And I'm going to argue to you that today all of these are connected. This is a reminder of the territory we are going to cover today, all the way from Pakistan up to the Mediterranean, and briefly bring in North Africa as well. But the main point that I will make to you is this. That this region is strategically connected. No longer is it possible for us to speak of territories in segments as if they are not linked with each other. I have pointed out here that this entire landscape, going from Pakistan up to the Mediterranean, embracing West Asia, North Africa, the Red Sea, and the East Mediterranean, now constitute one integrated security landscape. But this is a landscape in churn. There are just so many things happening simultaneously that it is difficult to take a deep breath and really understand what's on and what its implications are. We have indications that the United States no longer is the supremo in the region, the security provider of the region, the power that intervened so robustly and so violently in different areas, maintained a huge military presence in the region. That power seems to be indicating that they would like to dilute their interests and certainly dilute their military role. And even as I mentioned that, I have to point out that you have Russia and China emerging as a significant presence in this region, building up relationships very substantially all across this landscape which we call Eurasia today. And then this region is in churn. Almost every country that we will speak about is going through some form of domestic crisis. It could be an economic crisis. Many of the oil producers are concerned about the outlook for them in the face of climate change, volatile prices, impact on their domestic economy, their welfare measures, and at the end of the day, their authoritarian order. And then, of course, you have issues with regard to how do they manage their population. In days of plenty, you had resources available where you could silence the agitation for reform. And you could indicate at that time that we will retain, we the royal family will retain the monopoly of power, but we will look after your security and welfare. Is this scenario tenable anymore? Is a question that we need to ask. And then above all, you have a lot of new players in the region. This is the most significant aspect of global affairs, that it is not so much that the United States is declining as that many other role players are emerging as a significant presence in regional affairs, certainly, but also claiming a voice at the global platform. They want to be heard, they want to be respected, they want to be accommodated. You have powers from within the region itself which are now seeking a role. Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. Small countries that we barely thought of in terms of strategic interest, UAE and Qatar, are also agitating for a certain space and a certain role, some of it geopolitical, some of it economic, and some of it political as well. And then you have Israel, till now at the margins of the region, in conflict with the region, ill at ease with the region, and now it appears to be emerging from this status quo and building up relationships on a highly selective basis, and has been received largely quite reluctantly by the region so far. And yet it is there. It would indicate that possibly, just possibly, that while the region is a little more accommodative of Israel, could we possibly have a situation at some time in the future, I dare not say near future, but at some time in the future, when Israel also reinvents itself and starts looking at its Arab cousins with fresh eyes, and possibly exploring with them how they could once again live together as they had done all those centuries ago when Muslim empires had given them sanctuary and allowed their culture and their faith to flourish. This is something we can think about. And then there are these middle powers, which have so far not been strategically significant, largely because the United States loomed large all over the region. India, Japan, and France, just three nations. And I am suggesting that at some stage, you could see them shaping a certain role. All of this is in churn, and none of this is clear as yet. But these are pointers for where we could be going rather soon. Let me start with our neighbor when we look at the West. There I remind you, on 14th, 15th August 1947, we had the independence of India, certainly, which we celebrate with such enthusiasm. But we also had the previous day the partition of India. And it is the partition of India that we have tended to neglect in terms of its implications for our security and strategic interest. We are so consumed by the politics of communal divide that it engendered in us. But look at what it achieved in terms of geopolitics. At one stroke, India's historical ties, its frontiers with Central Asia and West Asia were snapped. And once we lost POK, all the passes that had taken our ancestors to Central Asia ceased to be under our control. There was another important implication, and that was that Pakistan made Kashmir a central issue in terms of shaping its new identity. And India responded similarly by giving priority to the state of Jammu and Kashmir as affirming its own identity. And therefore, you have a clash of competing identities on the same territory known as the state of Jammu and Kashmir, an issue that remains completely unresolved. And it is in this context that Pakistan fulfilled the reason for which it had been so carefully constructed, the strategic interests of Western powers. It very quickly joined, it was supported very robustly at the United Nations Security Council, when the issue of aggression by Pakistan was transformed into the issue of accession. a matter that remains with us. It remains on the books of the Security Council, and it remains an issue that divides us in the subcontinent. But it went further. Pakistan joined the Western Alliance. So now there was an ideological divide between India and Pakistan, because India espoused the principle of non-alignment while Pakistan allied itself with Western powers. And there was an enormous advantage to Pakistan because of this. It enjoyed total political support of Western powers for several decades and was equipped with the latest military equipment. This is something which we must focus on. Even as we have votaries within our country espousing this alliance with the Americans, let us never forget that this monster that we have in our West is a direct product of this affiliation with the United States. Beyond the Security Council resolutions, you had the Pakistan was then equipped and made ready for the 65 and 71 wars. The latter, we were intimidated with a military assault that did not happen, possibly largely because we had entered into the Indo-Soviet Treaty. And Pakistan got sustained support from the West as it mounted its assault upon India in the name of Islam. So this is where we are in terms of our immediate neighbor, but I have placed it in a historical and geopolitical context. One more event, not connected with Pakistan, but had implications later for our relationship, is that even as we became free in 1947, China in 1951 occupied Tibet. And overnight, India got this huge border directly now with China rather than the soft border we had with Tibet earlier. Very significant geopolitical implications, military and political implications for us. And this has been a slow burn. It had this border conflict in 1962, became quiescent for a while, and has once again become very significant in terms of our security very recently, once again. So this is the background in which we've had ties with our neighbor. Pakistan has reinvented itself in terms of its challenges to India. And it has now adopted the framework of Islam. But not Islam of the kind that any one of us would know about. This is extremist Islam. The kind of jihad that was nurtured on the battlefields of Afghanistan in the 1980s, where jihad was given a modern identity and was finally not only indoctrinated and armed and given battlefield experience, it was also given victory. It is from the battlefields of Afghanistan that Pakistan shaped the jihad against India. And while there have been occasional attempts to engage with each other, it now appears as if this issue, this divide, has now become so deep that it is now an integral part of our domestic affairs and not foreign policy anymore. And it is there where we find ourselves. The scenario obviously is complicated by the fact that even as we get indications from Washington that they are less enthused about their relationship with Pakistan, possibly after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where Pakistan's strategic value has diminished, Pakistan has very carefully, assiduously built up ties with China. So you have this powerful nexus of China and Pakistan that is a source of deep concern in New Delhi today. And that is what is a matter of ongoing military concern and has to some extent influenced some areas of our own foreign policy as well. And then we have Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been in the news for at least 40 years, all for wrong reasons. It has been a weak and vulnerable country, but a theater, a platform, a stage for conflict, big power conflict in the shape of the Cold War confrontation, which was by the Americans defined as a global jihad against godless communism. And then of course, as the Cold War ended with the withdrawal of the Soviet troops, that particular jihad came to haunt all its sponsors, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the United States. It suits Americans to have amnesia about their own role in fomenting this scourge. They are the ones who funded this jihad. They are the ones who armed it and left the management, the detailed management to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. But as victory was rewarded, as victory was awarded to these jihadi elements, they now became global, not because they had gathered together at the Pak-Afghan border, but because their veterans were now available to carry this battle to various other theaters and stages. And this is why you have the scourge of jihad all through the 1990s emanating from Pakistan, emanating from Afghanistan. 1996, Osama bin Laden met Mullah Omar and built up a strong, very unique symbiotic relationship. A relationship in terms of which Mullah Omar gave Osama bin Laden sanctuary and Osama bin Laden gave him a worldview of a jihad that was global in character and that would slowly but surely Islamicize the world. Mullah Omar bought this argument, it would appear. Revisionist writings indicate that his support was half-hearted. But his support for Osama bin Laden's safety and sanctuary remained unabated, despite numerous attempts to get him to loosen those ties and surrender Osama bin Laden. He refused to do that. And Osama bin Laden used that platform in Kandahar, in that obscure area of our neighborhood, used that platform of Kandahar to build, finally, this extraordinary assault upon the mainland of the United States on September 11, 21 years ago. This is an event that shook the United States. It was horrified. It failed to recall that it had itself nurtured this scourge that had now taken up a weaponry against the father that had spawned it. We have had, but you can see this superpower, very, very militarized, extremely well-armed, totally cruel and ruthless, had no strategic vision, had no understanding of its mission in Afghanistan. It floundered there for 20 years, killing thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Afghans, and gained no advantage for itself. And therefore, that ignominious departure is in keeping with this tradition. Because you have all weaponry and no cerebral capacity, you find from this episode the speed with which the Americans ran from Afghanistan and the humiliating circumstances in which they left after they had despoiled this nation for 20 years. It is in this background that you see the fumbling of this master operator. The Taliban came back. They came back victorious. They came back in charge of their capital. They have no experience of governance. They have no knowledge of statecraft. And they have very little intellectual capacity and ballast. Certainly, they have no knowledge whatsoever about constitutionalism. And they are now in charge of this country. And this monolithic entity that had fought the Americans now has splintered into numerous elements, some of them competing militants, some of them a little better equipped in terms of knowledge of the world and hoping that they will be able to steer this new nation into a better future. For India, this remains a matter of concern. We have opened an embassy in very difficult circumstances. We are concerned about the security of our personnel. We have received assaults in the past, and our diplomatic officials have been killed in bomb attacks. But at the same time, we do believe, and I believe correctly, that we should be there. It is an important entity for us. Absence of India means we've given a free ride to people whose interests do not coincide with ours. Our presence there would suggest over time that we could have a degree of influence in matters that finally evolve in this war-torn nation. It remains to be seen. But yes, we must commend our diplomacy for having the courage and the wisdom to go into Kabul and fly the Indian tricolor in that capital. And then we come to Iran. In Iran, all of us are familiar with the civilizational connectivity. And all of us are familiar how little has meant in recent years. In 2003, when President Khatami came to India, we set up a strategic partnership. We signed 15 agreements. We had a New Delhi declaration that spoke about about the path forward. We would have defense cooperation, intelligence cooperation, economic cooperation, energy cooperation, logistical connectivity. And I should remind you, ladies and gentlemen, in 2003, 10 years before Xi Jinping talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, we were offered Chabahar and the opportunity to set up connectivity with Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Moscow. So we would have had control of the north-south passages, even as China would seek 10 years later to coordinate with us the east-west connectivity. None of that happened. From 2004, India mortgaged its policy towards Afghanistan and subordinated its interests to the Americans. We did at that time the nuclear agreement. None of us in New Delhi had the courage and the capacity to tell the Americans that if you are building up a partnership with us, it is a partnership of equals who respect each other. And if you have respect for us and regard for us, you should be sensitive to our strategic interests. You have a certain hostility towards Iran, largely connected with your domestic scenario, your domestic politics, your affiliation with Israel, and all those lobbies that have taken control of the way you need to go forward and think. We don't. We are next door. We have substantial energy interests. Iran was at that time the second largest supplier of petroleum to us. We were talking about building their refineries. We were talking even about the Iran-Pakistan-India gas pipeline. We were talking about building up new connectivity projects, logistical connectivity, which would have had significant strategic value. But none of this mattered as far as New Delhi is concerned. And that is why I've said, all promise, no substance. Has that changed? Not at all. Nothing has changed. 19 years after Khatami, the agreements with Khatami, when Donald Trump came back, we once again mortgaged our own interests to those of the United States. That too with an abysmally incompetent regime that you had in Washington that was discredited the world over for its idiocy and its chaos. And they were our partners. We subordinated our interests to this country. Where were all those connectivity projects? We failed to develop Chabahar. We failed to develop the connectivity with Afghanistan and Central Asia. We talk so much about we have historic links here and there, but none of that is ever translated into reality. And in the meantime, what did the Chinese do? They talked about Obor, which became Belt and Road, and they have already got huge projects all across. Once about in 2018, I was writing an academic paper about what India could do in terms of logistical connectivity in the region. And I was focusing upon Iran. And as I wrote, to my horror, I saw that a train had come from Xi'an and had reached Tehran and was going to Madrid. And by the time I finished my paper 2 weeks later, that wretched train had gone to Madrid, come back to Tehran, was now on the way to Xi'an. Just one project in that entire landscape of Eurasia. Imagine how many more have come up since then. And this is where we are. We have a region that is in confusion. When I talk about West Asia, I will refer to that. But where are we? Has anybody spotted India taking a serious and substantial interest in this region that over the last 11 years has been mired in conflict? And if there had been a real conflagration, India's interests would have been seriously jeopardized. given that we get 80% of our oil from this region? So this is the failure. The failure is the inability to conceive and shape our interests and then pursue them vigorously. I'm not talking about tamasha. I'm not talking about drama. Somebody sits in a plane, goes and sits in the capital, has a photogenic opportunity and then returns home and gets onto the next flight. I'm not talking about that. I am talking about a vision. I will dilate on that in a minute. West Asia. West Asia has been important to us, but particularly important over the last 30 years, where there has been massive increase in the recruitment of our personnel. And our people who were about 1 million and odd in 1990 became 3 million in the year 2000 and became 6 million in 2010 and became 8.5 million in 2020. And we have diversified. We have, at one time in 1990, possibly our community was 90% blue collar. Today, while we have increased 8 times, our community is about 60% blue collar, and the balance are white collar people and increasingly the presence of our professionals. Possibly professionals are about 20% of our community all across. Indians are the majority community in 3 countries of the region, the UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar. We are the #1 community in every country of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Every year, these people who work there send back to the motherland about $35 billion. There are now figures which suggest it might be more. Every person who works there is an Indian national, and every one of them supports at least 4 people at home. Therefore, there are directly 40 million Indians directly benefiting from our engagement and our presence in the region. And much else has happened. We have energy connectivity. 50% of our oil comes from the GCC, and #1 supplier remaining Iran, and of course, in Saudi Arabia, and now increasingly Iraq because of the better terms on which they offer their oil. So we have an energy connectivity. This region is, as a whole, GCC is within the first 3 of our trade partnership. This is also the most important export destination for India. If India exports $25 billion worth of goods to the UAE, our #1 export destination, half of it goes to Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, East Africa, South Africa, and West Africa. Markets where Indian traders might not have gone on their own. These items come to Jabal Ali and are repackaged and sent as packaged in the UAE or transformed in the UAE or whatever. $5 billion worth of Indian goods go to Pakistan every year, and we get about $2 billion worth of Pakistani goods into India, all through UAE. So yes, we have a very substantial relationship with that. And there is the Modi Odyssey. From 2015 to 2019, there was a very robust focus on our engagement with this region. And strategic partnership agreements were entered into. And there is not only a substantial relationship that has emerged, but it is also a diverse relationship and a mutually beneficial relationship. There has been talk about defense cooperation, training and personnel, and also visits of high-level dignitaries, and also joint exercises, maritime exercises, both in the Gulf of Aden and in the Gulf of Oman. Very significant as far as India's interests are concerned. And yet, I have a cavil here, and it is this. This is a region that has been and continues to be very seriously in chaos. It has been at the edge of conflict, or regional conflict. If the good sense, particularly in Tehran, had not prevailed, you could actually have had a war, because Donald Trump was provoking the Iranians towards war, backed by the Israelis behind him. But it did not happen. But my regret is, for last several years I have argued that India is the best placed country to take forward our role, and instead of the transactional and bilateral relationship that we have with different countries, we now need to have a more important strategic role. I am not talking about a security role. I don't want to see Indian armed forces there. I don't want any Indian soldier to take a bullet. But what I want is the strength of our relationship that goes back several thousand years and which has generated such extraordinary cultural comfort on both sides and deep sense of mutual respect that has continued unabated. Because our relationship has constantly been refreshed. We should take advantage of that. India is held in very high respect. We are not only the land of Gandhi and Nehru and Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi. We also have very diverse relationship. We've had engagements with the region from Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee and from Mr. Modi. So we have very diverse. It is not linked with any particular party. It is a linkage of two great entities that have known each other for all these centuries, indeed a few millennia. And it is here that I would say to you that this is where we need to be playing a new role. We have not done this before. India has shied away from these kind of engagements. India has satisfied itself with what I have called bilateral and transactional relationships. But when a region is in chaos, when you have such significant energy linkages, which are not going to be diversified any time soon, when you have such significant economic connectivity, the principal area of our trade, the principal source of our investment, can we be completely indifferent? What about our people who live there? And I have argued to you with complete responsibility, and I have said this on the stage provided by the armed forces. One day, the first day of conflict, if there is a regional conflagration, you will have several thousand Indians dead. A country whose government's heart throbs for one maidservant mistreated in one remote corner of Saudi Arabia, can it remain indifferent to this prospect? If no other reason, this should focus our attention, that we should be engaged with the region. That era where you could stand away and watch from afar while the Americans continued their depredation, those days are gone. Today there is a new opportunity available. I'm not saying do it all on your own. Come forward with other partners. Japan possibly, Indonesia, Malaysia, possibly Russia, even France for that matter. The partners are not important. It is the leader who must go forward and shape this engagement. But there appears to be a reluctance to do that. And this is where we have to leave this scenario now. We are now, as I said, looking at a world in churn. We do not know which way it will go. You have the Biden administration, which came in with so much promise and now looks abysmally incompetent. You have this president abused Saudi Arabia on the election trail, called the kingdom a pariah nation and said he would boycott the crown prince. Look at that. This is the boycott. You have this because they are in a mess. There is serious issues that the president faces at home. He is looking at lame duck status fairly rapidly. And you never know which way things will go 2 years later. And you could have this ogre of Trump back in the White House or somebody very like him. So you have that kind of scenario. And then you have, so this is where we are, that the one presence that you assumed would be there for some time, regardless of the instability, insecurity, and violence that it had generated, it was there. Today, it is much less certain. And it is in this scenario where the US has such low credibility as a security provider that you need to come forward with fresh ideas. I am suggesting to you that so much is happening without the United States being involved. The Saudis and the Iranians have had 5 rounds of dialogue with each other in Baghdad and possibly one or two other places. Not much is known in the public domain about what has been achieved, but the fact of the dialogue is itself significant. Turkey has reached out to Egypt, UAE, and Saudi Arabia and has exchanged high-level visits. It appears to have abandoned its affiliation with Islamism and is now much more pragmatic in character. The fact is that it is there. The UAE has launched forth as a geopolitical role player in the region. And today UAE forces control the ports on the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, as also in the Horn of Africa. This little country that you can barely see on the map is today a significant geopolitical presence. It controls the island of Socotra and the island of Perim that controls the access into the Red Sea. Perim Island, right in the middle of the Red Sea, in the Bab el-Mandeb. This is a significant change that is happening right in front of our eyes. Saudi Arabia has occupied that province in the corner with the border of Oman and has changed the geopolitics of the region already. Saudi Arabia and UAE have intervened politically and financially to overturn the democratic processes in Tunisia and in Sudan. So this is the outreach. This is why my first sentence to you was that this region is now one single landscape. Israel continues to provoke Iran, and Iran also snaps back from time to time. But neither side appears to be interested in conflict. The JCPOA has been postponed largely because Biden did not want the agreement to become a factor in their elections at home in November. But I suspect it will be finalized in some shape or form and give a very temporary respite to the Iranians. But the most significant aspect, ladies and gentlemen, of the scenario in West Asia is the outreach of the region to Russia and China, and their very high stakes in what is happening in the region. I don't need to elaborate to you Russia's very central role in global energy politics in the shape of OPEC+. China is the number one trade partner of all the countries of the region. It has executed 125 projects in the region valued at $150 billion. There are 500,000 Chinese living in the UAE, when a few years ago there wasn't any. So China is a significant presence. It has been brought to the region by the Belt and Road. And as it's an initiative, it is constantly taking in more and more people as participants. UAE is a very enthusiastic player, not just as an investor, as a consultant and contractor, because it is a global leader as far as infrastructure development is concerned. Saudi Arabia wants to come on board, and Iran is already there, both in terms of land and sea. So this is what we have to see, that all around us we are looking at very important developments. And I cannot but refer very briefly to the implications for regional and global affairs of the Ukraine war. Ukraine war was systematically and deliberately provoked by the Americans. They thought that they would create, it's done by the Cold Warriors who never died away in 1990 and remained a robust presence in US affairs since then. For them, the principal enemy of the United States was Russia, and Russia never went away. Hence, the continued expansion of NATO eastwards and constantly threatening Russia with the missiles that they located, which were targeting all the major cities of Russia. And it is in this scenario that we have to see the background of the war. War aims possibly could have evolved as the war has continued, but it is today, as far as United States is concerned, as of now, the United States has committed itself to this conflict in order to ensure that its own hegemony over the world, which was in doubt just a few months earlier, today is reinforced. And that this hegemony is based on the subordination and support of the Europeans, which is also happening. At a time when there was a fear that the European Union might build up an alternative and independent strategic posture in world affairs, at that time we find that they have they have decided that they will continue. A few minutes more. This is the overview of the region. The US is confronting China and Russia. China and Russia have built up substantial bilateral relations and as of now appear to be working together and expanding their influence in Eurasia. China and Russia have reached out together and separately to Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Turkey, and now to West Asia. They've also reached out to the Arab countries of West Asia. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the old order defined by the Americans is now in jeopardy and that there is a new order that could shape. Hence, the importance of the Ukraine war. What does all this mean for India? What it means for India is that for centuries, in a historical perspective, for centuries, we were a very actively engaged entity. Our traders were the most significant presence on the old Silk Route. We had large traditional communities all across Central Asia, and Central Asians were frequently coming in. The goods that went from the east to the west along the Silk Route were carried by Indian traders, not by the Chinese. We used to do cross-border trade with the Chinese and then take their silks and other items all the way to Antioch and beyond. We were a presence. And this is the significance of what is happening now. That we kept, through non-alignment, we maintained a certain global outreach, a global profile, and a global presence. But now, ladies and gentlemen, there appears to be a change. That kind of globally engaged entity that we knew and admired, and we were indeed a part of, has now been subordinated to the competitions and conflicts of identity politics at home. This domestic priority has meant that the strategic vision that India had, the perspective of its own global outreach and presence, and the significance that it exercised all across the region, all of that has got very significantly diluted to the extent of being non-existent. In panic, as we saw the rise of China, some of us advocated the embrace of the Americans, and we went along with the Quad. And all we realize now that that was completely a useless enterprise, and we have done course correction and are no longer that deeply engaged. But there is, ladies and gentlemen, a larger issue and concern, and that concerns all of us, and that is this. In 1994, an American writer came to India. He spent 3 or 4 months here. His name was Tanham. And Tanham wrote a paper which is there on the internet called India's Strategic Vision. He had been sent by the Americans to find out how India will be positioning itself in the post-Cold War era. Tanham has said in his report, which is available on the internet, that India has no strategic vision whatsoever, and that its decision-making on security issues is done on the basis that is ad hoc, short-term, defensive, and reactive. All these years later, ladies and gentlemen, does anyone believe this has changed? And I would say to you that this has to change. The world that I have sketched out before you is an extraordinarily challenging entity. And it is that. It is not as if because India is focused elsewhere and is overturning the idea of India and creating a narrower vision of our great country. Does it mean that the rest of the world has stopped its diplomatic activity? And that realities are being created all around us in territories that are of crucial strategic importance to us, where our footprints have traversed for millennia. Are we going to close our eyes and our minds and our ears and pretend none of that matters? And that is what I would say to you, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion. We need a strategic vision, a long-term vision, which is consensual in character, based on the national unity of our country, where everyone feels a part of that nation, where you have a situation that there is no divide between domestic and foreign policy, but each supports the other. And then you are able to harness resources to achieve that vision. Build up strategies to go forward. Constantly review those strategies. Build up alternative action plans to support us. That is my message to you, ladies and gentlemen. That is what we need to do, and that is what our young generation should be working towards. Thank you very much. And all